History as it happens, April 22nd, 2021. Reassessing the Cold War.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Ronald Reagan reverses course with kind words for Gorbachev's Kremlin.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant.
Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
30 years ago, the Soviet Union completed its collapse and the Cold War ended, not in a dreaded nuclear holocaust, but with a peaceful goodbye. And for a moment it appeared a new era of unquestioned American predominance would unfold. It proved an illusion. Reassessing the end of the Cold War, next, as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
During the 90 days that began on April 6th in 1994, Rwanda experienced the most intensive slaughter in this blood-filled century we are about to leave.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
So we started with some familiar voices, but do you know who this is?
Mikhail
Gorbachev, Christmas Day 1991, resigning as president of the USSR. And that was that. The Cold War had been winding down for some years before the Soviet Union fell to pieces. The Iron Curtain's disappearance in Eastern Europe was pretty much complete by 1989-1990. And while 1991 ended with Gorbachev stepping aside, that year began with the U.S.-led coalition expelling Saddam Hussein's Iraq from Kuwait. A use of force to which Gorbachev gave his blessing. Such a move would have been unthinkable at the height of the Cold War. Iraq had been an old Soviet ally. It was about this time when the political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously wrote, "We had reached the end of history, the triumph of liberal democracy and free markets." Fukuyama's thesis has been picked apart 1,000 different ways. Last year, at the Munich Security Conference, he tried to explain what he had meant 3 decades ago. This clip runs about a minute or so.
I have now spent 31 years being asked, well, what about the end of history? Wasn't that completely wrong? And this didn't start recently. This started virtually the moment I published that piece. So I just want to get a couple of things out, just so there's not any misunderstanding. The end of history was not my phrase. It comes from the philosopher Hegel. History, in his understanding, is what we would today call modernization or development. And end did not mean termination, it meant objective, target. And so the question of the end of history is, where does the modernization process lead to? What's the highest form of human, social, and political organization? And what I said was the Marxists, for the last 150 years, have been saying the end of history is going to be communism. And my observation in really the summer of 1988 or the winter of 1988-89, when Gorbachev was reforming the Soviet Union, was that it didn't look like we would get there. That we would stop at the stage before communism, which the Marxists called bourgeois democracy. And I didn't see a higher form of society that would replace liberal democracy.
There is another way to interpret Fukuyama, although I'm not sure he would agree, but let's lay out a few of its ideas. The USSR's defeat meant not only that the U.S. had won, but the U.S. brought about the Soviet collapse.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Democracy, free markets, now on the march, and the natural desire of all humankind.
I think we've been surprised that Fukuyama was so wrong, but at the same time, I've been impressed that Paul Kennedy was so right.
That's historian Jeffrey Engel. In a moment, we'll hear his reassessment of the Cold War's end, and we'll tell you who Paul Kennedy was. A few years ago, Engel wrote an excellent book titled When the World Seemed New. In it, he takes us back to the early 1990s. The U.S., he wrote, might well have been the most powerful state in human history. With the rivalry with the USSR out of the way, sustained peace seemed possible. The U.S. had real influence, as it headed a large and prosperous group of allies and trading partners. So how did that all turn out? Well, let's return to that critique of Fukuyama and take a look around the globe for a moment. U.S. power is now in decline after 20 years of war in the Middle East, the incalculable loss of blood, influence, and prestige. In short, the victory in the Cold War proved an illusion. And when it comes to the post-Cold War international order, more than a few strongmen have survived, such as Vladimir Putin. Democracy did not survive in the former Soviet Union, and the transition to capitalism was a disaster. China, also not a democracy, may soon possess the world's largest economy, and if you haven't noticed, American capitalism has had its share of troubles over the past decade or so. Check out this headline in The Economist. China is now applying calculated doses of pain to shock Westerners into realizing that the old American-led order is ending. Imagine in 1991 being told that's what awaited the world 30 years later. Jeffrey Engel is founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he's the author, as mentioned, of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Jeffrey Engel, welcome.
Hi, it's good to talk to you.
So the Cold War ends, let's say 1991, or maybe I should ask you, is that a good date to pick? I know the Berlin Wall fell before that and the Iron Curtain came down, but the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Would you agree that's as good a date as any?
That's the one which I use. I think there's two things that happened in 1991. First, the Gulf War, which wouldn't have been possible had the Cold War still been raging, because Iraq was a key ally of the Soviet Union. So if the Cold War had been going on, there's no way the Soviets would have allowed the United States such a free hand to attack one of its client states. And then the second, as you mentioned, is the coup against Gorbachev in August. And by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union doesn't formally exist anymore. So there's all kinds of dates you could use, but I like the whole year of 91 as the best answer.
So as you noted in your book, when George H.W. Bush left office in 1993, the United States was the most powerful nation possibly in human history compared to the other countries in the world in the early 1990s. The USSR is gone, the Gulf War is over, and the U.S. economy is on its way to a pretty strong decade. As Francis Fukuyama famously put it, we are at the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. How about that for triumphalism? So how, in your view, have the past 30 years unfolded in ways that we did not expect?
You know, it's interesting because there's, in addition to Fukuyama and his end of history argument suggesting that we had reached the final destination, if you will, of humans' discovery of what best way to govern themselves, there's a second argument actually that is intertwined or in competition with it. And that's one that came out just a few years earlier from Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And he really best articulated, he wasn't the only one saying this, but he best articulated the idea that actually America's empire and the American society was on the downward slope, much like the British had been and the Soviets and so on. So I think we've been surprised that Fukuyama was so wrong. But at the same time, I've been impressed that Paul Kennedy was so right, that America's power has steadily eroded because in large measure of the incredible investments we did not make in infrastructure and education during the latter parts of the Cold War.
So in what other ways have the past 3 decades played out differently than you expected? Again, with the starting point, at least in the eyes of some, that the United States is at its zenith. We have won the Cold War.
Well, not only have we reached the height of its power, but again, going back to Fukuyama, we were on the right side of history. We believed that the world was going to continue to flow in a democratic fashion. And more importantly, that the United States was the unquestioned champion of those democratic factions. And we were, frankly, it's hard to imagine or to recall, but the United States was extremely popular throughout the world as the country that everybody else looked up to in many ways, not what we have, unfortunately, today. And so I think that we've seen over the last 30 years, democracy did not have the hold that we had hoped, but also in part, this is our fault. because we tried to push democracy faster than it could have naturally evolved. And I'm thinking in particular, after 9/11, there was a fundamental shift in American policymaking from allowing democracy to evolve as the natural endpoint of government to forcing democracy to evolve, to catalyzing the process. And that didn't work and doesn't seem to work. The only thing it did seem to do is erode our power even further.
So when it came to respecting the sovereignty of other nations to allow them to develop on their own, George H.W. Bush at least espoused that belief, as you document in your book. But we didn't follow that in many instances. And to what degree was the disappearance of the USSR a factor in that? Because that constraint was no longer around.
There wasn't that constraint. We were allowed, especially as 20th century began to 21st, and after 9/11, we had such awesome and predominant, bordering on hegemonic military power throughout almost the entire world, perhaps with the exception of the Pacific Rim, that we didn't need to restrain ourselves. Previously, we had been restrained by the fact that there was another massive nuclear power out there that typically opposed whatever it is we wanted to do, and we typically opposed whatever they wanted to do. Without any restraint, without any opposition, we essentially thought that we could speed up the processes of history. So if the reason that American policymakers were so enthused at the end of the Cold War was because they thought everything they had always believed in was right, by the 21st century, and especially after 9/11, when the security environment catalyzes people's fears, by the 21st century, American policymakers didn't just think they were right. They knew that everyone else had to believe the same way in our rightness in order for the world to be safe. Really a fundamental shift.
We can probably still safely say, however, that the USSR lost the Cold War, right?
Yes. In fact, this is actually a really key formulation, the way you said it. It is critical to understand that the USSR lost the Cold War, not that the United States won it, because Soviet policymakers realized by the 1970s, and they all understood this, that their system wasn't working, that the system was failing. It wasn't producing the moral enthusiasm and political enthusiasm by its people. It wasn't producing the material needs that the people required. And in the United States, there is a apocryphal history, a fable really, that American policymakers, in particular Ronald Reagan, saw Soviet decline and decided to push it further by upping an arms race, by putting the Soviets under greater moral and political stress, which caused the Soviet Union to decline. That's just not the way the causal arrow goes. The Soviets knew that they were in trouble and decided to reform, and knew they had to reform well before Reagan took office.
That's right, because by Brezhnev's time, it's about holding on to power. The idea of creating a communist utopia is long gone, although there were some modest improvements in quality of life in the Soviet Union during that period. But eventually, ultimately, the system reformed itself out of existence. Where Reagan deserves credit is in de-escalating the Cold War, not necessarily bringing about the end of the Soviet Union. Those are two different things.
Oh, I would completely agree with that. I mean, I'd like to point out that the Reagan foreign policy really is nicely divided between a first term and a second term.
So he was a hardliner early on.
Yeah. And then he did make, and give him all the credit in the world, he did make the decision to essentially reach back when Mikhail Gorbachev extended a hand of peace and a hand of trust. Reagan, the ultimate Cold Warrior in his first term, in his second term, reached across and took that hand and worked for a more peaceful world, something that no one would have expected, frankly, that Reagan would have done if you just look solely at his first term. It's really an impressive transformation within Reagan.
Yes, Ronald Reagan had an important pragmatic side to him. So let's return to this notion of misplaced confidence in American power as the Cold War is coming to an end, or what the scholar Alfred McCoy today calls Washington's delusion of endless world dominion. Let's look at China compared to the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which you document so well in your book, compared to China today vying for world power. Yet in China, democracy did not follow economic prosperity.
Yeah, that's actually really the key to the way American policymakers, frankly, most policymakers around the world, viewed the natural progression of society and of rights, that you give people more economic rights and they're going to naturally get a more comfortable life. And when you're more comfortable, you want more political liberties. So American policymakers, and again, others around the world, expected China throughout the 1980s and subsequently, because they knew they were trying to reform their economy. They just presumed that democratic reforms would follow. There had never been an occasion in world history where economic liberty had been given and political liberty had not followed in turn. And American policymakers simply expected China to turn out like everyone else. Now, I have to say one other thing about this. There's an awful lesson embedded in comparing China's end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union's end of the Cold War, in that the Chinese obviously used force to put down their pro-democracy movement. Force is not good when used against your own people, but that regime still exists. The regimes of the Soviet Empire, in particular in Eastern Europe, that chose not to use force, that accepted reformation, none of those regimes are around today.
Well, it's really interesting because China's conversion to a market economy, at least partly, has been successful, whereas the transition to capitalism in Russia was a catastrophe.
Exactly. And I think one of the reasons is frankly because of leadership. The Chinese leadership recognized that they needed to fully embrace capitalism for the purpose of developing more economic prosperity for their own people. In Russia, I think there was just frankly a different mindset. Following the initial enthusiasm of the turn to markets and the turn to democracy in the early 1990s, was a period of tremendous economic and moral and political devastation for the post-Soviet peoples, that the economy tanked. I was there in 1994 doing research, and there was no food to be had, no matter how much money you had. And so the few people who had power at that time and had access to funds essentially were able to look out less for the well-being of the country than for the well-being of themselves. And were able to more easily consolidate power, again, because it was a new regime and a new system. You know, when you go from a state-controlled economy where the state controls and owns everything and turn that private, that allows for a lot of opportunities for people to accumulate wealth if they so want. The Chinese never went through that because they never actually had a loss of their state. They had an evolution to capitalism that could be done in a more controlled manner.
Unlike China, the Soviet Union was dismembered, and it was robbed from within, the so-called oligarchs.
Yeah, I prefer the term kleptocrats. People who entered the government who were more than willing to, for lack of a better word, steal their way to greater and greater power. And again, because it's a new government and because the rules are all new, there was really an impressive opportunity for people who wanted to manipulate the system for their own benefit to do so. Let me give you one great example. You know, if you have a Soviet steel factory that is going to be put up for sale to the people around, that people can go and bid on the steel factory, the government said, well, we have to announce this publicly. But there was nobody watching to make sure that they announced it publicly in a way that the public would actually hear. So you might have the government, the city ownership, the city leadership announce the sale of a steel factory, you know, by opening the door and saying it out loud at 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing that their buddy was right there and the sale would go off at 3:15. You know, you can do a lot with auctions when there's only one buyer.
So you mentioned the use of force, and this is why I believe Gorbachev must be considered one of the heroes, although maybe heroes is going too far, of the 20th century, because as his nation was falling apart, because of his reforms, he decided not to spill blood to keep it together. That's not to say that the collapse of the USSR was entirely bloodless. There were a couple of episodes where security forces cracked down. But for the most part, Gorbachev did not clench his fist.
No, and I think we need to remember something that you just said is critically important, that none of what occurred with the dissolution of the Soviet Union was ever Gorbachev's intention. He was a true communist and he was a true patriot and a Soviet patriot. And he wanted more than anything else to reform Soviet society so that it could keep going, not so it could collapse. But he was something else unusual, which I think is the reason why he deserves so much credit, at least outside of Russia, in that he was also genuinely a political philosopher. I don't think that we've had maybe a president since maybe Thomas Jefferson who could equal him as a person who thought philosophy first, then government. And ultimately, Gorbachev got to the place after several years of reform, after perestroika, political reform, and glasnost, societal reform, of believing that human beings had the right to choose their own path. And it was simply wrong to use force. It may be the right thing politically, but it's the wrong thing morally. And when you have a philosopher leader, morals sometimes matter a great deal. And in Gorbachev, they certainly did.
Well, Gorbachev seemed to have a better understanding of the world than past Soviet leaders. If I'm not mistaken, wasn't he the only Soviet premier to have traveled to Western Europe before taking power? And when he did visit Western Europe, he saw how people on the same continent were living much better than people in his own country.
I think that's an area where I think we can actually overstate Gorbachev, because he was not unique in traveling, and he was not unique in appreciating in any way, shape, or form that the system was crumbling around him. So there's essentially two kinds of policymakers in the world. There are those who recognize a problem, and then there are those who have the guts to do something about that. A series of Soviet regimes had recognized the problem from Brezhnev's years on. Gorbachev simply had the guts to try.
And the irony about the great reformer was that his economic reforms failed spectacularly, and he was less popular in the Soviet Union than he was just about everywhere else.
We think of him as one of the great heroes of the 20th century, and Russian leaders today portray him actively as one of the great dullards and pathetic morons of the 20th century for the way that they gave away the Soviet empire. And I think this is a moment where we can look back and say timing matters, because Gorbachev leaves office in 91. The economy tanks, political corruption is on the rise, chaos in the streets, crime in the streets. I mean, again, when I was there in the 90s, Russian citizens in Moscow literally could not go outside at night. It was just too dangerous. And 10 years before, you could have never had to worry about that kind of petty crime in the Soviet Union. So he leaves and things get terrible. And then eventually the economy bottoms out and starts to do better right around the time that Vladimir Putin comes into office. And I think that's actually not a causality. I think that that's correlation, that after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was always going to be a bad time of history and always going to be a bad economy for the Soviet people. Everyone knew the transition to capitalism, which had never been done before in such a rapid scale, was going to be painful. It just so happened that when people experienced the pain, it was very easy to pin the blame for it on the man who had just left office.
I wasn't intending to speak about Gorbachev this much, but I'm glad we are. This is fascinating. Of course, these are my great interviewing skills. I had a list of questions to ask you about the problems the U.S. has encountered as the world's sole superpower, but let's stay with Russia for one more thread. One of the apparent failures of the post-Cold War system or post-Cold War order was that Russia was not integrated into the West or made part of a stable world order. To this day, the U.S. and Russia continue to have an antagonistic relationship.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those occasions where both sides can tell a story that makes them feel good about themselves. The Western version of this story is that the Cold War ended, we opened our arms and we gave economic aid, maybe not as much as we could have, but a lot, to Russia and post-Soviet states. And Russia in particular decided to go in a different direction, decided to eschew democracy and focus more on the markets. From the Soviet/Russian perspective, they tell a different story. They say, we gave up. We were the ones who ended the Cold War peacefully. I mean, empires usually go out with a bang. And we actively chose not to, with the promise that you were going to help us. And as I said before, in the decade after Soviet dissolution, Russian society crumbles. So there's a narrative to be told on the Russian side that we gave up, you were supposed to help us, and things got really bad for us. And then you did one other thing that's really critical. Then you moved NATO closer to us.
Yes.
You essentially promised us that we were going to be part of a whole Europe. And instead, what you did essentially was move the fortress of Europe closer and closer to us, but not allow us in.
So George H.W. Bush, who is the subject of your book, When the World Seemed New, I read it as a reappraisal of his foreign policy vision and what he hoped for the world when he left office in 1993. As we've been discussing, it didn't work out that way. But part of his vision was stability, and here is the lifelong Cold Warrior who now doesn't want the Soviet Union to collapse. He was worried about what might happen if the whole country fell apart.
Well, certainly he would have been very happy with a democratic Soviet Union. There was no reason that the state itself needed to dissolve so much as reform. And I think this is where it's a useful moment to compare Bush with Reagan. He was a person who said, my plan for the Cold War is we win, they lose. Bush is the kind of guy that came in and looked at that and said, well, what do you do the next day? I mean, after the Soviets lose, then what? That the strategy that Reagan employed didn't really have a lot of details on how to transition a defeated nuclear superpower into a peaceful, long-term, stable relationship. And that was really the problem that fell on Bush's administration almost from day one, that we have unprecedented change within the international system. And that means the chance for a lot of chaos. And their goal was to avoid chaos at all costs. In fact, I think you could make the argument, I would make the argument, that in a sense, they were the victims of their own successes. Bush worked so well and worked so hard to keep chaos at bay. He obviously was not the only one who did this, but we're talking about American politics in the next sentence I'm going to offer. Bush worked so well and kept chaos at bay. It seemed as though by the time he went for re-election, there was no need for him to stick around since he had solved all the international problems and had solved them largely quietly. So the American people didn't know and would not learn for another 25 years exactly how instrumental he had been. So in a sense, his re-election was the dog that didn't bark. There was no need for a foreign policy president because he had done so well. And I think that's one of the reasons he only enjoyed a single term.
It is amazing. We were consumed with the Soviet Union for decades, then suddenly it's gone and our attention turns to domestic affairs, and it's bye-bye Reagan and Bush.
This is actually the very topic I'm working on now, is try to understand this fundamental conundrum puzzle that Americans at the end of the Cold War, we are militarily on top. We've just won the Gulf War. We have gotten rid of the Vietnam syndrome. There is no doubt that we are the global hegemon, and history seems to have come to an end with us on top. And yet, in 1991-92, 4 out of 5 Americans asked the question, is the country going in the right direction, said no. And it was largely because of the economy.
Allow me this digression, but when you brought up Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union, we win, they lose. I feel that's how American policymakers have been approaching Iran for many years. Total defeat of Iran, or trying to bring about regime change. When, in fact, Reagan himself said in the 1980s, we have to acknowledge that the revolution of the Ayatollahs is a fact of history. But not to digress.
No, it's not a digression. It's quite critical. I mean, so American policymakers today across the board, in fact, my own Texas Senator Ted Cruz is very fond of saying, my strategy for whatever he happens to be talking about that time, my strategy is Reagan's for the Cold War. We win, they lose. And I tell my students every day, that's not a strategy, that's an aspiration. Knowing that you're going to shake a country's or the world's snow globe and not know where all the pieces are going to land is actually a very treacherous and dangerous thing. And it's at the heart of why regime change has proven so difficult, or at least perhaps as difficult as those who understood the problems correctly thought it would be. That you simply cannot go into countries, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, disrupt everything about the society and then expect it to easily turn out well. Doesn't mean it can't turn out well, but it's not necessary. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it's probably going to be much more difficult than knocking over the regime in the first place.
So let's stay with the theme of where the U.S. went wrong. The historian Arnie Westad, in his aptly titled book, The Cold War, argued that U.S. triumphalism came in 2 forms. The Clinton version, which prioritized global prosperity and market values, and he says the Clinton administration failed to institutionalize cooperation, especially among other great powers, such as China and Russia, and then the result was failed states, such as Afghanistan and Rwanda. The second form of triumphalism was George W. Bush's emphasis on predominance. So let's start with Clinton. Do you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I'm less critical of Clinton for not doing more than I am of George W. Bush for doing too much. which is to say, yes, there was a great opportunity for Clinton to make concrete all the gains of the Cold War. But there's no reason to think that that needs to be done in 4 or 8 years. And I think the Clinton administration actually did quite a lot to enable countries, if they chose, to further integrate themselves into the American-led democratic capitalist world. They certainly opened up lots of opportunities and tried to resolve a lot of conflicts around the world, not only Yugoslavia, obviously, but towards the very end, unfortunately, unsuccessfully, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Northern Ireland conflict, the idea being that America, as the strongest power of the world, as the role model for the world, could help create peaceful environments from which proper democratic institutions would flourish. After 9/11, the Bush administration took that triumphalism and essentially catalyzed it, put it on steroids, to say it's not that we want to create a peaceful environment so that democratic institutions can flourish, it's that we are going to forge democratic institutions around the world. And frankly, I think Clinton's ideas were more in line with the fundamental approach of American policymakers since 1945, that we're right and we're just going to let the rest of the world come to learn it, as opposed to after 9/11, when the approach became, we're right and we'll show you.
And as I mentioned, Westad is critical of the way the W. Bush administration approached foreign policy after 9/11, large-scale military invasions, preemptive war. I don't know if we're living in a post-Cold War world as much as we are a post-9/11 world. I want our listeners to consider just how much prestige and standing the United States has frittered away over the past 20 years because of its approach to foreign policy.
I think, sadly, that's the logical and reasonable conclusion, that we did, in fact, do too much. And again, let's be fair as historians. After 9/11, there was a great deal of anxiety and fear. So we should at least remember that the policymakers, who I think almost all of us agree at this point made poor strategic choices, thinking again about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, did so in a nervous environment. And we need to appreciate that if we want to understand the context. But at the same time, I also think that Americans need to understand the Cold War's end really does matter, because for the 40 odd years before it, we had a unifying enemy and a unifying principle. That was to say that our society must prove itself better than a different kind of society. And that provided guide rails to American society, that, you know, at the end of the day, people, they might have different ideas, but they, by and large, pulled in the same direction. Frankly, at the end of the Cold War, I think one of the things that we did not expect was that with the guardrails taken off by having no further adversary, we essentially allowed, and this sounds initially like a positive, but there are downsides. We allowed the liberalism and the open discussion of ideas to run wild. You know, during the Cold War, there were lots of conspiracy theories, but you always presumed somebody was in charge. It was the superpowers, and that you couldn't go too far before calm people would take over. And after the Cold War, there's no such guarantee.
So the Cold War ends and the international system that defined it is gone. And then Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. So I'd like to get your take on the so-called New World Order, the international system that George H.W. Bush supposedly wanted to form with the way he built a global consensus around the use of force to expel Saddam. Because I found it fascinating when reading your book that the initial reaction of some administration officials to Saddam's invasion was, well, so what? What difference does it make if a barrel of oil has an Iraqi flag or a Kuwaiti one? But it seems President Bush sensed an opportunity to assert American power.
Well, and not just an opportunity to assert American power, but more importantly, an event has occurred that we must respond to. We don't have the luxury of not responding, because then that new world order coming into being would be stillborn from the beginning. And why? Well, because the new world order wasn't new. It was essentially Franklin Roosevelt's view of the world. George H.W. Bush, when he was a young man flying off aircraft carriers in the Pacific, would have heard talk of internationalism, would have heard talk of a United Nations coming into being, would have heard talk of free trade being one of the central elements of peaceful interactions between nations. And the Cold War did not allow Roosevelt's world to come into being. Well, with the Cold War over, now Bush and those around him thought, now we finally have the chance, we've won, to do it right, to set up the world that we all fought for in our youth. And there's just a real tragedy, in a sense, historically to this, as we review it, that one of the things that Bush was chided for in his declarations of his New World Order was the suggestion that there was nothing new. The truth is, there was nothing new, and that was the whole point. Americans had actually been hearing about this for 2 generations at this point. Bush was just simply trying to say, and he's not always the best messenger, now we have the opportunity to do what we've always wanted. And it's not something new, it's who we are.
And I want our listeners to know that I'm not taking a position either way on whether the United States should have went to war in 1991 to expel Saddam or bomb Baghdad. I was 16 years old in 1991, although I do remember a lot of the TV coverage, and I also remember that there was a good deal of opposition to that war.
Well, and you and I are the same age, and I remember one of the most vivid memories I will ever have, I think, is of the first night that the Desert Shield turned to Desert Storm, the first night that the bombing occurred. I was working on a student newspaper at the time, and we were doing a late night session, and I have never heard a room full of 50 people grow so silent as when we heard the news that the war had started and that Americans were bombing people around the world. And we just turned on the news and listened to it while we continued to work in silence. I tell that to my students today, and they don't quite appreciate it because, frankly, the Americans have been bombing someone every day of their lives. And it used to be a big deal when the United States deployed its force militarily overseas, especially to the extent of the Gulf War. And there was tremendous opposition. The country, in terms of whether or not it was a good idea to go to war, was 51-49 in 1991. The final vote that the Senate offered for authorization, and I'd like to come back to that if I could, the final vote that the Senate offered for authorization was a very close run thing. Bush's side only won by a couple of votes. That needs to be noted as different than the country's support for the troops. That this is a moment after Vietnam where the general narrative had been that Americans' military had not been publicly supported enough. The troops were wildly supported, perhaps even over-supported by the American people. But the idea of sending them into combat 10,000 miles away with the expectation that we're fighting the 4th largest military in the world, and the Pentagon, it leaked out to the press, has ordered 50,000 body bags for American troops. That is not something the American people were enthusiastic about joining. Just to return, if I could, to the final thought, one of the most amazing things that has been discovered in the archives of the Bush Library, from which I based most of my book on, is from the American side, is that George Bush was adamant to his advisors in his diary and in his own mind that even if he had lost that Senate vote for authorization, he was going to go to war anyway. And his reasoning was, I'm the commander in chief, I have the authority, and if Congress believes I've done something wrong and wants to impeach me, that's their responsibility. And here's the thing, this war is going to be over really quick. I mean, he was quite confident that we were going to be successful. Well, his military commanders were telling him so. And essentially, he said to himself and to Dick Cheney and to those around him who were advisors, let's just see Congress try to impeach me after we've won a war and I have a 90% approval rating from the American people. That's not going to happen. So he never, of course, had to cross this Rubicon because he did get the vote his way, but he was more than ready to go to war of his own volition.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because President Bush seems, in retrospect, to have been a measured man. But his rhetoric got out of control there. He continued to compare Saddam Hussein to Hitler. And he talked about the Iraqi military as if it were some powerful force when it really was a hollowed out shell.
You know, I think I'm more bothered by the Hitler elevation of rhetoric in the sense that, and it's really quite interesting, you know, George Bush starts out the war saying we must defeat Saddam Hussein. And then as the months go on, it becomes we must defeat Saddam Hussein because he's evil. And we all know the lesson of Munich and the lesson of appeasement is if you don't stop evil now, you're going to have to stop it later. And eventually he starts to say out loud that Saddam Hussein is Hitler. And then he says Saddam Hussein is worse than Hitler. And what's really interesting is that his advisors pulled him aside and said, "Sir, don't say that. We don't need that fight. It's not right. But also, why are you causing this kerfluffle in the news over comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler? Just say he's a bad guy."
Saddam was an SOB, but he owed his regime survival in the 1980s to the Reagan administration during the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah, I mean, Saddam had good reasons, if you will, not to trust Americans, because in the 80s, they gave him a lot of aid to fight the Iranians. And then it subsequently came out that they sold missiles to the Iranians to kill Iraqis. So Saddam is distrustful. But Bush's rhetoric is fascinating because he does listen to his advisors at that point. He does stop comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler. But I've just been working through some more of his private papers. And the truth is, he keeps saying it privately. He keeps saying it in his diary. He keeps saying that Saddam Hussein is Hitler. Now, he's smart enough not to say it out loud, but he certainly thinks it in his heart.
I do remember that, reading the passages from his diaries that you cited in your book. And I asked myself the same thing. Does this man who fought in World War II really believe this? So in the final analysis, why did the United States go to war in 1991? New World Order? Oil? It wasn't because Saddam Hussein was Hitler.
I think we do have to give a lot of credit to the broad New World Order argument. I mean, let's stipulate a couple of things. If this is not happening in an oil-rich state, in an oil-requiring world, nobody cares. But you can't just say that this war was fought for oil. I think you have to say oil is what made the war important. Ultimately, the Bush administration believed, and again, we have incredible documentation on this, that they didn't really care about Kuwait in the least. Kuwait was not a democracy, and Kuwait was not even a popular country throughout the Middle East. What they really cared about was proving at the end of the Cold War that one country couldn't just invade another without consequences. And frankly, you couldn't have asked for a better script. I mean, if you went to Hollywood and said, write me up a script of a way to justify a war, and you came back by saying, well, we've got an evil dictator who seems to be like Hitler, who gasses his own people, who commits atrocities left, right, and center. It's at the most important natural resource site in the entire world. And he's just done something that even 3-year-olds know is wrong. That is to say, crossing somebody's border illegally. No Hollywood producer would have taken that script because they would have said, this is too easy. Mm-hmm. This is too unbelievable.
Jeffrey Engel, let's try to wrap up. I'll try to keep my final question to under 5,000 paragraphs here.
I'll do the same with my answer.
I do have the tendency sometimes to get lost in a maze, but this has been fascinating. So here we are in 2021. Cold War has been over for 30 years. Is U.S. power on the decline? And why?
Well, I hate to say this, but it depends what your definition of is.
Well, we certainly have more nuclear weapons than everyone else. So in that regard, we're still.
And I think we should always have a reference to Bill Clinton's impeachment whenever we can get one in. The truth is, we are clearly in decline from where we were. The arrow is going down on the graph. We are not, and there's a reason for that is in large measure because other countries have gotten more powerful. Remember, the key thing about power is that it's not an absolute. It's always a comparative value. We are not as comparably strong as we were at the end of the Cold War. Now, does that mean that we could not reverse the arrow? Does that mean that we could not see greater prosperity for the country and continuation of American power, even in a more powerful world? I can say the trend lines are going down and have been going down, but I can also tell you they are still, to my mind, reversible. America's foreign policy after 9/11, and frankly, America's foreign policy in the Trump era, which included a rejection of a cooperative spirit with the rest of the world, exacerbated our decline. But if our decline was exacerbated by our actions, then I think it can also be restrained by our actions.
And I guess it's important to define what I mean by power. Military power is maybe the first thing that comes to mind when people think about the potential of the United States. But if we're no longer powerful enough to invade other countries, that's probably a good thing. But there are other forms of power, soft power and American influence to deal with issues like climate change, for instance. I mean, that's still important.
Yeah, I mean, let me rephrase what you said.
Please do.
To put it in a different context. Nobody doubts our war-making abilities. We are unrivaled in our ability to destroy things. And we put a lot of effort and energy into that over the last decades. What is in doubt is our peacemaking abilities. And I don't just mean at the end of a war. I mean to sustain peaceful relations so we don't have to go to war. I mean, one of the things that is a great tragedy of American society and American foreign policy is we have invested so heavily in our military, and we've invested so heavily in supporting our military culture. Everybody knows you're supposed to support the troops, that the military has in large measure become not only the most venerated institution in American society, but the one that we look to as the optimum of American society. You got a problem, you send in the military and they'll solve it because they always do. First of all, that's not true. We ask unreasonable things of them. But more importantly, we have forgotten the idea that policymakers throughout history, and certainly in the first centuries of our society, of our own country, understood that when you had to call the military, it's because everything else had failed. It was a failure of diplomacy, a failure of policymaking, a failure of thinking, a failure of imagination that led to the point where you had to kill your enemy to make them comply. We need to work more on those other skills. Having perfected our ability to kill, we need to think harder about not celebrating that so much as improving our ability to not have to kill.
Jeffrey Engel, author of When the World Seemed New. Thank you for being here. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay with this theme and zero in on the American way of war.
There is no such thing as a Democrat or Republican war. We vote on this resolution in the same way brave young men and women in uniform will fight and die as a result of our vote, as Americans.
Do America's wars ever end anymore? That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.